Fragments from an Education. Orwell, Connolly, Waugh, Betjeman, to name only a few, have pungently described the disenchantments of school days. I do not wish to appear less competent than my contemporaries in making creep the flesh of the epicure of sadomasochistic school reminiscence. From Anthony Powell, Infants of the Spring. That stoic redskin interlude, which our schools intrude between the fast-flowing tears of the child and the man. Evelyn Waugh, Brideshead Revisited. I now claim Stanford, California as part of my own turf, but I was extremely apprehensive and feeling very junior when I first glimpsed the campus in 1987. The impression of first day at school in its grand quads was only enhanced by the effort of my old friend Edward Said, with whom I was visiting the campus for a conference to encourage me to feel more at home. "Come on," he said, "we'll go and take a cocktail from Ian Watt." I was made additionally nervous by the thought of introduction to this dry, wry, and donnish figure. The world's expert on Joseph Conrad and the author of The Rise of the Novel. On greeting, he caused me to feel even more uneasy by drawing attention to the unusual number of Japanese students who could be seen from his windows. I know it's silly to say so, but it still makes me feel odd sometimes. Nobody could have been less chauvinistic than Ian Watt, but then he was one of the few survivors of the bridge on the River Kwai, the Burma Railroad, Changi Jail in Singapore, and other Hirohito horrors that still capitalize in my mind. He admitted later that detecting other people's reserve after returning home from these wartime nightmares, he had developed a manner of discussing them apotropaically, as it were, so as to diffuse them a bit, and he told me the following tale, which I set down with the hope that it captures his memorably laconic tone of voice. Well, we were in a cell that was probably built for 6, but was holding about 16 of us. There wasn't much food, and we hadn't been given any water for quite a while. The heat was absolutely ferocious. Dysentery had begun to take its toll, which was distinctly disagreeable at such close quarters. Added to this unpleasantness, we could hear one of our number being rather badly beaten by the Japanese guards, with rifle butts, it seemed, in their guardroom down the corridor. At this rather trying moment, one of my young subalterns, who'd managed to fall asleep, started screaming and flailing and yelling. He was shouting, "No, no, please don't. Not anymore. Not again. Oh God, please." Hideous noises like that. I had to take a snap decision to prevent panic. So I ordered the sergeant to slap him and wake him up. When he came to, he apologized for being a bore, but brokenly confessed that he had dreamed that he was back at Tonbridge. My laughter at this, for all its brilliant timing and understatement, was very slightly awkward. Watt went on to recall an interview with that other old Asia hand, E.M. Forster, in which he had been asked, as an old boy of Tonbridge School, whether he would ever agree to write an article for the school magazine. "Only," said the author of A Passage to India, "if it could be against compulsory games." The very phrase compulsory games had automatic resonance for me, bringing back not merely the memory of freezing soccer and rugby pitches, and of the gloating sadist who infested the changing rooms that were the aftermath of these pointless contests, but also W. H. Audin's suggestive line in one of his greatest poems, 1st of September 1939, "And helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game." It was indeed Audin who had been a master at such a school, as well as having been a pupil at one, who had said that the experience had given him an indistinctive understanding of what it would be like to live under fascism. He had also said, when told by the headmaster, that only the cream attended the school. Yes, I know what you mean, thick and rich. But this is where I must very slightly disappoint you. The 3 great subjects of beating, bullying, and buggery, the junior or cadet equivalent of Winston Churchill's naval triptych of rum, sodomy, and the lash, are familiar enough to me in their way, and I have often been closely questioned, usually by girls, about their influence on my formation. I was subjected to a certain amount, to a certain extent, to the first 2 of the big B's, but not to the third. I should perhaps add that I was never big or strong or desperate enough to inflict any of the above procedures on anyone else. In fact, in the annals of British boarding school trauma, I scarcely count even as walking wounded. This is because at the very last moment I was saved from having to go to Tonbridge. Have you ever walked away from a car smash without a scathe, or had that other experience so well evoked by Winston Churchill? The sheer perfect relief of being shot at by someone who has missed you? I have in fact had both these experiences, but neither approximates to my sense of deliverance from the Tonbridgian. It was once again a matter of my mother versus my father, neither of them knowing anything about the upper reaches of the education system. It had been decided when I was born to put my name down for the only school with which we had contact, run by someone who had once been on the same warship as the commander. This seemed an efficient rather than a random way of doing things. However, and just before I was due to take the entrance exam at the age of 13, my mother bethought herself that it might be worth taking a look at the place where I was due to be conscripted for the next 5 formative years. You would not, gentle reader, be scanning these pages had it been otherwise. Tonbridge was a synonym for those Spartan schools where the empire, the church, the cricket field, the war memorial, and the monarchy were, well, sovereign. The blue-eyed boy, small for his age and with rather feminine eyelashes, who is indifferent to sports and happiest in the library, is buggered. Not to say beaten and bullied. All this Yvonne saw, or I suppose I should say somehow intuited at a glance. My poor parents. During my infancy in Scotland, I had to be taken away from one school with the forbidding name of Inchkeith when it had been noticed at home that I cowered and flung up a protective arm every time an adult male came near me. Investigation showed the place to be a minor hell of flagellation and abuse. Such a pathetic euphemism for the real thing. So I was taken away and put in a nearer establishment named Camdean. On my first day there, I was hit between the eyes with a piece of slate during an exchange of views with the Catholic school across the road, with whom our hardened Protestant gangs were at odds. Innocent of any interest in this quarrel, I nonetheless bear the faint scar of it above the bridge of my nose to this day. For the next 5 years, by now removed southward to Devon, where my Fifeshire accent was duly knocked out of me, I underwent an experience that was once commonplace, but has now become as remote and obscure in its way as travel by steam train. Indeed, I often have difficulty convincing my graduate students that I really did go off to prep school at the age of 8, from station platforms begrimed with coal dust and echoing to the mounting whomp, whomp, woof, woof of the pistons beginning to turn as my own trunk and tuck box were loaded into a luggage car. Not only that, but I wore corduroy shorts in all weathers, blazers with a school crest on Sundays, slept in a dormitory with open windows, began every day with a cold bath, followed by the declension of Latin irregular verbs, wolfed lumpy porridge for breakfast, attended compulsory divine service every morning and evening, and kept a diary in which, in a special code, I recorded the number of times when I was left alone with a grown-up man who was perhaps 4 times my weight and 5 times my age, and bent over to be thrashed with a cane. The strange thing, or so I now think, was the way in which it didn't feel all that strange. The fictions and cartoons of Nigel Molesworth, of Paul Pennyfeather in Wild's Decline and Fall, and numberless other chapters of English literary folklore have somehow made all this mania and ritual appear normal, even praiseworthy. Did we suspect our schoolmasters, not to mention their weirdly attenuated female companions or wives, when they had any, of being in any way odd, not to say queer? We had scarcely the equipment with which to express the idea. And anyway, what would this awful thought make of our parents, who were paying, as we were so often reminded, a pricely sum for our privileged existences? The word privilege was indeed employed without stint. Yes, I think that must have been it. If we had not been certain that we were better off than the oafs and jerks who lived on housing estates and went to state-run day schools, we might have asked more questions about being robbed of all privacy, encouraged to inform on one another, taught how to fawn upon authority and turn upon the vulnerable outsider, and subjected at all times to rules which it was not always possible to understand, let alone obey. I think it was that last point which impressed itself upon me most, and which made me shudder with recognition when I read Auden's otherwise overwrought comparison of the English boarding school to a totalitarian regime. The conventional word that is employed to describe tyranny is systematic. The true essence of dictatorship is in fact not its regularity, but its unpredictability and caprice. Those who live under it must never be able to relax, must never quite be sure if they have followed the rules correctly or not. The only rule of thumb was, whatever is not compulsory is forbidden. Thus, the ruled can always be found to be in the wrong. The ability to run such a system is among the greatest pleasures of arbitrary authority, and I count myself lucky, if that's the word, to have worked this out by the time I was 10. Later in life, I came up with the term micromegalomaniac to describe those who are content to maintain absolute domination of a small sphere. I know what the germ of the idea was, all right. Hitchens, take that look off your face. Near instant panic. I hadn't realized I was wearing a look. Face crime. Hitchens, report yourself at once to the study. Report myself for what, sir? Don't make it worse for yourself, Hitchens. You know perfectly well. But I didn't. And then, Hitchens, it's not just that you have let the whole school down, you have let yourself down. To myself I was frantically muttering, now what? It turned out to be some dormitory sex game, from which, though the fools in charge didn't know it, I had in fact been excluded. But a protestation of my innocence would have been, as in any inquisition, an additional proof of guilt. There were other manifestations too. There was nowhere to hide. The lavatory doors sometimes had no bolts. One was always subject to invigilation, waking and sleeping. Collective punishment was something I learned about swiftly. Until the offender confesses in public, a giant voice would intone, all your privileges will be withdrawn. There were cute curfews where we were kept at our desk in our dormitories under a cloud of threats while officialdom prowled the corridors in search of unspecified crimes and criminals. Again, I stress the matter of sheer scale. The teachers were enormous compared to us, and this lent a Brobdingnagian aspect to the scene. In seeming contrast, but in fact as reinforcement, there would be long and jolly periods where masters and boys would join in scenes of compulsory enthusiasm, usually over achievements of a sports team, and would celebrate great moments of victory over lesser and smaller schools. I remember years later reading about Stalin that the inmates of his inner circle were always at their most nervous when he was in a good mood, and understanding instantly what was meant by that. And yet it still wasn't fascism, and the men and women who ran this bizarre microcosm were dedicated to their own weird way. The school was on the edge of Dartmoor, the site of the famously grim prison in Waugh's Decline and Fall, and Haggard. Despairing escaped convicts were more than once recaptured after hiding in the sheds on our cricket grounds. Yet the natural beauty of the region was astonishing, and our teachers were on hand all day and at weekends, many of them conveying their enthusiasm for birds and animals and trees. We were all of us compelled to sit through lessons of sinister fairy tales of Christianity as well, and nature was sometimes enlisted as illustrating God's design, but I can't pretend that I hated singing the hymns or learning the psalms, and I enjoyed being in the choir, and was honored when asked to read from the lectern on Sundays. In fact, as you have perhaps guessed, I was getting an early training in the idea that life meant keeping two separate and distinct set of books. If my parents knew what really went on at the school, I used to think, not being the first little boy to imagine that my main job was that of protecting parental innocence, they would faint from the shock. So I would be staunch and defend them from the knowledge. Meanwhile, and speaking of books, the school possessed its very own library, and several of the masters had private collections of their own, to which one might be admitted, not always without risk to these men's immortal souls, as a great threat. This often feels as if it happened to somebody else, yet I can be sure it did not, because I can recall the element of sadomasochism so well. Awareness of this, no doubt, innate in all of us, and I suppose a case could be made for teaching it to children as part of sex education or the facts of life, but I had to sit in a freezing classroom at first light, at a tender age, and hear my silver-haired Latin teacher, Mr. Witherington, approach the verge of tears as he digressed from the study of Caesar and Tacitus and told us with an awful catch in his voice of the way in which he had been flogged at Eastbourne School. At that same brutish academy, we thought as we squirmed our tiny rears on the wooden benches, was one of those to which we were supposed to aspire. I think I wish I had not been introduced so early to the connection between obscure sexual excitement and the infliction or the reception of pain. Again come the two sets of books. I would escape to the library and lose myself in the adventure stories of John Buchan and Sapper and G.A. Henty and Percy Westerman, and acquaint myself with imperial and military values just as, unknown to me in the England of the late 1950s that lay outside the school's boundary, these were going straight out of style. Meanwhile, and on the other side of the ledger, I would tell myself that I wasn't really part of the hierarchy of cruelty, either as bully or victim. I wasn't any use at sports. I didn't have the kind of keenness that made one even a junior prefect, but on the other hand, I did need to protect myself from being a mere weed and weakling and kickbag. Sometimes there was a fatso or freak toward whom I could divert the attention of the mob, but I can honestly claim to have become ashamed of this tactic. There came a day when, without exactly realizing it in a fully conscious matter, I understood that words could function as weapons. I don't remember all the offenses and hurts that had been inflicted on me, but I do recollect exactly what I said as I whirled on my playground tormentor, an especially vile boy named Welchman, who was a snitch and stool pigeon as well as the embodiment of the not invariable reliable maxim that all bullies are cowards at heart. You, I said in fairly level but loud tones through my split lips, are a liar, a bully, a coward, and a thief. It was amazing to see the way in which this lummox fell back, his face filling with alarm. It was also quite something to see the tide of playground public opinion turn so suddenly against him. Looking back, it is the masochistic element that impresses me more than the sadistic one. It's relatively easy to see why people want to exert power over others, but what fascinated me was the way in which the victims colluded in the business. Bullies would acquire a personal squad of toadies with impressive speed and ease. The more tyrannical the schoolmaster, the more those who lived in fear of him would rush to placate him and to anticipate his moods. Small boys who were ill-favored or out of favor with authority would swiftly attract the derision and contempt of the majority as well. I still writhe when I think how little I did to oppose this. My tongue sharpened itself mainly in my own defense. The commander by now not being a huge figure in my universe, the substitute father figures of school authority took up correspondingly more space. Years later, Alexander Waugh, inspired biographer of his own father and grandfather, showed me Franz Kafka's Letter to My Father. I didn't find this fascinating document, which old Kafka never read, reminding me at all of my domestic pater, but I know exactly what came to me when I read Kafka's recollection of the many occasions on which I had, according to your clearly expressed opinion, deserved a beating but was let off at the last moment by your grace. I again accumulated only a huge sense of guilt. On every side I was to blame. I was in your debt. My memory of how that felt was as vivid as possible. Gratitude for having been spared, vague guilt at an offense I had not known about or guessed at, strong fear of a repeat offense that I could not predict or avoid, the emotion of relief colliding with the feeling of unworthiness, and fear of the all-powerful boss, too, combined with an awareness of all the blessings and forgiveness which it was in his almighty power to bestow. One of the most awful reproaches in the school's arsenal of psychological torture, Orwell catches it very well in his essay, Such Were the Joys, was the one about one's sickly ingratitude, the selfish refusal to shape up after all that had been done on one's behalf. Of course, I now recognize that this is the working model drawn from monotheistic religion, where love is compulsory and must be offered to a higher being whom one must necessarily also fear. This moral blackmail is based on a quintessential servility. The fact that the headmaster held a prayer book and the Bible during services also drove home to me the obvious fact that religion is an excellent reinforcement of shaky temporal authority. Hugh Wortman, my huge and dominating headmaster, and introducer to the dark arts of corporal punishment, was a lifelong bachelor, but some of the local mothers found him handsome. And Yvonne gaily said that he put her in mind of Rex Harrison. His huge, brawny, furry arms, his immense horseshoes of teeth made him seem almost gorilla-like to me, and a bold contrast to a rather slight figure of the commander. His rages would shake the windows and make small boys turn white. His good moods were a hell to endure and a challenge to manipulate. Heaven knows what he'd been through sexually. He himself didn't stoop to fiddling with any of us, but if you were occasionally favored, as I occasionally was, you would have given a copy of David Blaze or one of the Jeremy novels and asked if you'd care to read it in your free time. Though I didn't have the vocabulary for this in those days, I now know quite a lot about E.F. Benson and Hugh Walpole, and I sensed even then that this was the world of the smoldering and yearning and repressed adult homosexual, fixated on his own school days, and probably most attracted to those who are themselves blithely unaware of the intensity of the attention. There were also some masters, twitchy and sad at the end of their tethers and the close of their careers, who by the same herd instinct we knew to be fair game. Poor old Mr. Robertson, Rubber Guts, with his decrepit Austin chair and his equally decrepit wife Lydia, could not keep order and made the fatal mistake of trying to curry favor with the boys by little acts of kindness and bribery with sweets. He was childless and pathetic, and he taught the unmanly subject of geography, and we somehow knew that the real authorities in the school didn't respect him either. So we felt free to make his life a misery. There was more satisfaction to be had in teasing and torturing a feeble member of the establishment than there was in the cornering some hapless and pustular bedwetter of our own cohort. Rubber Guts eventually left the school, for all I know, died in poverty in some seaside boarding house. But before we broke him in, the poor childless chap swooped in on me one day in the changing rooms, caught me under the armpits, held me up, and gave me, or to be exact, my forehead, the most chaste possible kiss. Then he put me down and sadly mooched away. At first I thought I had a good tale to share with my fellow gloating little beasts, but then I found myself admitting that there had been nothing so creepy about it, merely something melancholy, and I never said a word to a soul. It is strange how the boundary between the knowing and the innocent is subconsciously patrolled. One may be apparently quite wised up, while being in a reality quite naive or entirely unaware of the grosser aspects of existence, while yet possessing some intuition of what lies on the other side of the adult veil. I couldn't make this encounter seem dirty, while there were boys more advanced than myself who could make even the word clean sound suggestive. I suspected that they sometimes pretended to know more than they really did. I was also pretending, but I was bluffing in a different way about my aptitude in English literature and history. Backward in hormonal development, I could show precocity when it came to longer words and harder books. The best plan here is to bite off more than you can chew. At the age of 12, I had summoned the nerve to borrow from the headmaster and to read War and Peace. Emboldened by the sheer bulk of the thing, I swerved into Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico. Of these I retained for a long time, apart from the fascinating family trees of the Rostovs and Bolkonskis, the memory of the Battle of Borodino and of the military alliance between the people of Tlaxcala and the Spaniards against the Aztecs. In other words, I was inhaling these classics essentially as adventure stories. But when I later had to take an examination on Henry V, I was able to make a comparison between King Henry, the night before Agincourt, and Pierre Bezukhov before Borodino, which made me feel that I hadn't just been showing off to myself, or indeed to others. Nonetheless, I was probably insufferable until one very observant master, a man named Eyre, who was later sacked after a horrific lapse into pederasty, instilled in me a sense of proportion. "You might try this," he said diffidently, slipping into my hand the first novel of Evelyn Waugh. The headmaster followed up with some P.G. Wodehouse. How can I forget that moment when, in the company of Paul Pennyfeather and Mr. Mulliner, I learned that to be amusing was not to be frivolous, and that language, always the language, was the magic key as much prose as to poetry. Perhaps 2 or 3 times a year I receive a questionnaire from some writer's organization, or some writerly magazine, asking me to name my formative books. The temptation to inflate the currency of the past is always present. It was when perusing the immoral Gustave Flaubert at the tender age of X that my eyes were opened to. In fact, I suspect that it doesn't very much matter what one reads in the early years, once one has acquired the essential ability to read for pleasure alone. My parents were less quick than my teachers to get this point. I had an erratic godmother, who on one of her visits decided to make up for all her previous lapses, and actually to provide me with a present. I was accordingly taken by the whole family to a fine bookshop in Plymouth, and told to pick any 6 books that I liked. It didn't take long. I wanted a garish series of the adventures of Billy Bunter. I was sternly told by my seniors that this wouldn't do at all, and provided instead with a very handsome set of Arthur Ransom's uplifting stories about enterprising English children in the great outdoors. In revenge, these remained mouldering on my top shelf, never even opened, until I contrived to leave them behind in one of our many family moves. Thus, all-knowing, I passed up the chance of introduction to an author who, as Manchester Guardian correspondent in Moscow 1918, had exposed the secret treaties that were behind the First World War, and that had a fling with Trotsky's secretary into the bargain. It shocked me to discover this later on, as it would most certainly have shocked the relatives who pressed ransom on me. My mother was out of sorts for a whole day. "Silly boy," she said, "Aunt Pam was in such a good mood that you could easily have had a nice wristwatch if you had asked for it." But I didn't want a bloody wristwatch. I wanted to be left alone with a pile of books of my own choice. And very gradually, as it does, omnivorous reading began to become a little more discriminating. I spent a long time wallowing in the pleasures of the good bad book, as G.K. Chesterton, later plagiarized by George Orwell, was to term this tempting genre. John Buchan's Richard Hannay romances and colonial yarns, and then Neville Shute's stories about Australia, Malaya, engineering, and, with his masterpiece On the Beach, the foretaste of nuclear anxiety. Dennis Wheatley's melodramas of Satanism and the occult, spiced with a very heavy dash of reactionary politics, gave me a brief interest in numerology, and then helped to inoculate me against superstition in general. C.S. Forrester's Hornblower stories had perhaps unintended effect, in that they showed me that a British naval hero could simultaneously be a martyr to doubt and introspection, as well as be aware of the slave trade, which up until then I thought the Royal Navy had aided only in putting down. On a seemingly parallel track, I was still being educated for an order of things that, without my fully realizing it, was very rapidly passing away. Hearing something about fighting in far-off British-run Malaya, I would think about a boy whose father served there that the Malays were like. "Jolly loyal," was his reply. Even at the time, this struck me as cryptically unsatisfactory. The situation in the Central African Federation sometimes seeped into the news. When I inquired about southern Rhodesia, one of the masters instantly said that the native inhabitants were only just down from the trees, the first but not all the last time that I was to hear that loathsome expression. The only mentionable problem with the existing conservative government of Harold Macmillan was that it was too liberal and had given in to the Wogs and Gippos, Egyptians, over the Suez Canal. On Guy Fawkes night, that wondrous evening of roast chestnuts and fireworks and mellow fruitfulness, the ceremonial pyre was often surmounted by a symbolically unpopular figure of a later vintage than 1605. One year the headmaster decreed that the immolated carcass be that of Sir David Eccles, then a blamelessly mediocre minister of education. He had allowed himself to make some remarks that were critical of the public, or rather private, schools. The essential rampart of English educational hierarchy. "Hitchens," said the terrifying Mr. Wortham, "you have a sense of history, or so it seems. If our great public schools were to be swept away, it would be worse even than the dissolution of the monasteries." Having at that stage only cropped and grazed on the lower slopes of Wordsworthian verse, I cannot quite visualize the proportions of this world historical calamity. But I seem to see an epoch passing, and the roofs of great places suddenly open to the pitiless sky.